He pointed at her like she was something he'd stepped in. You. The man's voice cut across the entire ballroom. Senator Harold Greer, red-faced, bourbon in hand, finger aimed directly at Imani's chest. What do you think you're doing, standing there listening? You people always lurking around where you don't belong. The room went cold. Imani stood perfectly still in her housekeeping uniform, cart beside her, not a single muscle in her face moving. Greer laughed, that drunk, entitled laugh that people like him had been perfecting for generations. You actually think you understand any of this music? Honey, this piano costs more than your entire family will ever see in a lifetime. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Imani turned, slowly, deliberately, and looked at Dante Vercelli. You're playing the final passage wrong. If you've ever been laughed at, overlooked, or told you didn't belong somewhere, stay with me. Because what happened inside that ballroom on a cold November night in Chicago changed everything for everyone in that room. And I promise you, by the time this story ends, you'll understand exactly why. Hit subscribe if you're new here, and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. If this one moves you, hit that like button. Now let's go back to where it all began. The Vercelli Grand Hotel had a smell that Imani Brooks had learned to identify in the first 20 minutes of her first shift. Old money, fresh flowers, and something underneath both of those things that she could never quite name. Power, maybe. Or the absence of consequence. She had been working temporary housekeeping shifts there for 6 weeks by the time the night of the charity gala arrived. 6 weeks of pushing a cart through marble corridors, of learning which guests left tips and which ones left messes, of memorizing the back routes through the service hallways so she never had to walk through a main lobby when guests were present. Not because she was told to stay invisible. She had simply learned, over years of this kind of work, that it was easier. Easier wasn't the same as painless. She understood the difference. Imani was 28 years old and had been working since she was 15. Not the kind of working that people mention in interviews to sound relatable. Actual working. The kind that starts before sunrise and ends after midnight. The kind that leaves calluses and a particular expression on a person's face that never fully goes away. She had worked retail, food service, hotel cleaning, event catering, and a dozen other jobs that required showing up on time, doing the work correctly, and being treated as though she were part of the furniture. She was good at all of it. She was also, though nobody at the Vercelli Grand had yet figured this out, the most musically gifted person in the building on most days. Which was saying something, because the hotel employed 3 in-house musicians, hosted private recitals twice monthly, and maintained a Steinway concert grand in the ballroom that had once belonged to a woman named Mafia Vercelli, who had been, by all accounts, a pianist of genuine and serious talent. Imani knew about the piano because she had read about it. She read about most things. She carried paperback books in the deep pocket of her uniform jacket and read during 15-minute breaks in the staff room when her colleagues were scrolling through their phones. She had read about the Vercelli family's history in a discarded architectural magazine she'd found in a penthouse suite 3 weeks earlier, had read about the charity gala and its traditions, and had read, in a footnote so brief it almost didn't register, that the late Mafia Vercelli had been a classical pianist who'd studied in Milan before her marriage. The footnote hadn't mentioned what had happened to Mafia Vercelli after the marriage. Imani had noticed the omission. She noticed things like that. The gala started at 8 o'clock. By 9:30, Imani was working the east corridor on the ballroom level, moving methodically through her assigned areas, collecting the wreckage that 200 wealthy guests produced without thinking about it. Napkins on the floor, an abandoned high heel near a potted ficus, a glass placed on top of a wall sconce in a way that defied both physics and common sense. She had just finished clearing the restroom corridor when she heard it. Piano music. Coming from the ballroom service entrance, which was 20 feet away and slightly ajar. This was not unusual. The in-house musicians sometimes used the service entrance for equipment. What was unusual was the piece being played. Imani stopped walking. She knew the composition. She had known it for 11 years since the night she was 17 years old and working a closing shift at a hotel in Indianapolis. And a woman from the estate liquidation team had left a cardboard box of old recordings in the service corridor marked free. Estate items. And Imani had taken 3 of them because the labels were handwritten, and she was curious. One of the recordings had been a woman playing an unnamed composition on piano. No label except the initials MV and a date, 1987. Imani had listened to that recording so many times the tape had stretched. She had transcribed the notes by hand onto graph paper because she couldn't afford sheet music. She had learned every measure of it by memory, playing it in her head during overnight shifts when her hands had nothing to do. She had never heard anyone else play it. Until now. She drifted toward the service entrance without deciding to. Her body just moved. The door was open 4 inches, and through those 4 inches she could see the edge of the piano and the back of a man's shoulders and his hands on the keys. He played well. Better than well. There was something technical and precise about the way he moved through the piece that suggested years of training rather than natural instinct. But it was also somehow colder than the recording she knew, more controlled, like he was playing from memory rather than from whatever it was that the woman on the tape had played from. And then he reached the final passage. Imani's jaw tightened slightly. He was wrong. Not catastrophically, not obviously. A person who'd never heard the piece wouldn't notice it. But there was a variation in the third measure of the final passage, a chord resolution that the woman on the tape had played with a particular warmth, a slight lingering on the middle note that made the whole ending feel like something settling rather than something stopping. He played it flatter, technically correct by any standard sheet music interpretation, but not how MV had played it, not how it was supposed to feel. Imani stood there for approximately 4 minutes, listening, trying to work out whether she was wrong. She wasn't. She had heard that passage so many times she could have sung it in her sleep. She was still standing there when her supervisor Marcus appeared at the end of the corridor and gave her a look that communicated, without words, that she was behind schedule, and he was already irritated about it. She went back to work. By 11 o'clock, the gala was at that particular stage of a wealthy event where the food has been finished and the alcohol has been doing its work for 2 hours, and people begin to feel that the normal rules of behavior are somewhat negotiable. Imani was collecting glasses from a side table near the ballroom's east entrance when Senator Harold Greer found her. She had seen Greer earlier in the evening. Hard to miss him, loud in the specific way that men who have never been told to quiet down are loud, moving through the room with the certainty of someone who had never once in his life been asked to wait. He was on his 4th or possibly 5th bourbon by now, and he had brought 2 other men with him as an audience, which was always the thing that made a certain kind of drunk man dangerous. He didn't say anything at first. He just stopped a foot away from her and looked at her the way people sometimes looked at a piece of furniture they were considering rearranging. "You," he said. Imani kept collecting glasses. "Hey, I'm talking to you." She looked up. "Sir." "What are you doing standing next to the entrance? This is a private event." "I'm working, sir, collecting glasses." Greer looked at the other 2 men and made a face. "Collecting glasses." He said it the way people repeat things when they want the repetition itself to be an insult. "Right outside the ballroom." "Yes, sir." "You were listening to the music." Imani didn't answer that. "You people always lurking around where you don't belong," Greer said. The you people landed in the air and hung there. "Honey, do you even know what that instrument in there is? That's a Steinway Model D. That thing costs more than your entire family is going to see in a lifetime." There were people nearby now. A cluster of guests who had drifted toward the entrance had gone quiet. The way people go quiet when something either wonderful or terrible is about to happen, and they want to make sure they have a clear view. Imani felt the familiar weight of the calculation she had made so many times before. How to respond. Whether to respond. What responding would cost her. She needed this job. Marcus was already irritated with her. The agency that placed her here had 3 other hotels they could send her to, or none. She breathed in slowly. And then, from inside the ballroom, the piano began again. Dante Vercelli had returned to the piano for what she understood, from the whispers around her, would be the midnight performance. He was playing the opening measures of the same piece she had heard through the service door, and the guests who had been drifting toward the entrance now turned back to watch him. Except Greer, who was still looking at Imani. "Can you even read music?" he said. "You know what notes are?" Someone nearby laughed. Not unkindly, exactly, more the nervous laugh of people who aren't comfortable with what's happening but also aren't going to stop it. Imani looked past Greer into the ballroom. She could see Dante at the piano now. A tall man, Dark-suited, still in the way that suggested stillness was a choice he had made rather than a quality he was born with. He was playing without looking at the keys. His eyes were somewhere else entirely. He had reached the final passage. He played it wrong. The same way he'd played it in rehearsal, the same flatness, the same missing warmth. And something in Imani, some accumulated weight of 6 weeks of invisible work and 17 years of being overlooked. And one very specific night, 11 years ago, when she had listened to a dead woman play this piece on a stretched cassette tape and understood for the first time that music was the one thing in the world that made her feel like she was actually present in her own life. Something moved. She turned to face Greer directly. "You're playing the final passage wrong," she said. Greer blinked. "Excuse me?" "Not you." She looked past him, into the ballroom, directly at Dante Vercelli at the piano. Her voice was calm and clear and loud enough to carry. "Him. He's playing the final passage wrong." The ballroom went silent. Not the polite silence of people paying attention. The specific electric silence of 200 people realizing simultaneously that something has just occurred that cannot be undone. Dante's hands stilled on the keys. He turned his head slowly toward the entrance. Imani had, in the second since she said it, run through the probable outcomes with the detached efficiency of someone who had been calculating social risk since childhood. She was going to be removed. She was going to lose this job. Marcus was going to be furious. The agency might drop her. She had $43 in her checking account, and her rent was due in 9 days. She had said it anyway. Dante Vercelli stood up from the piano bench. He was taller standing than he had looked sitting. The room moved around him slightly as he walked toward the entrance. Not physically, but in some atmospheric way, the way rooms shifted when a person walked through them who other people had learned to make room for. He was not rushing. I was moving at the particular pace of a man who knows that whatever he's walking toward will still be there when he arrives. He stopped in front of Imani. He was perhaps 6 inches taller than her and looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not anger, something more complicated than anger. "You heard a mistake," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," Imani said. "In the final passage. Third measure, the chord resolution. You're ending it too cleanly. The middle note needs to hold longer before the resolution. It should feel like something settling, not something stopping." She had not planned to say all of that, but she had also not planned any of the last 90 seconds, so she let it stand. Dante looked at her for a long moment. Around them 200 people were not breathing. Greer made a sound that was probably intended to be a laugh. "Now wait just a..." Dante held up one hand without looking at Greer, and Greer stopped talking immediately. Completely. Like a device that had been switched off. Dante kept his eyes on Imani. "Who taught you?" he said. "Nobody." He waited, because that clearly wasn't a complete answer. "I heard a recording," Imani said, "a long time ago, of someone else playing this piece. A woman. I learned it from that." Something moved across Dante's face. So quickly she almost missed it. A tightening. A thing that wasn't quite recognition and wasn't quite grief and was somewhere in between. He said nothing for 3 seconds. Then he stepped back and extended one arm toward the piano. "Then show me," he said. The murmur that went through the room was audible and immediate. Imani heard someone say, "That's not appropriate." She heard someone else say this should be interesting in a tone that made the word interesting mean something ugly. She looked at the piano. She looked at Dante. He was watching her with an expression that she still couldn't fully read, but there was something in it that she recognized. The specific look of a person who has been waiting a long time to be surprised by something and is not entirely sure how to handle the fact that it might be happening now. Imani walked toward the piano. She was aware of her uniform. She was aware of the 200 people watching her. She was aware that her hands were completely steady, which surprised her, because her heart was doing something irregular behind her ribs. She sat down on the bench. The Steinway was the most magnificent instrument she had ever been this close to. She had played battered uprights in practice rooms, a slightly out-of-tune baby grand in a hotel lobby in Cincinnati, and approximately 47 different sets of keys that ranged from adequate to genuinely terrible. She had never sat at something like this. Her hands found the opening position without her thinking about it. Muscle memory that had been built from nothing, from repeated listening and repeated imagining and years of practicing on whatever was available. She began to play. She played it from the beginning, correctly, precisely, with the kind of structural fidelity that would have satisfied any conservatory professor. She moved through the piece the way she had heard it 1,000 times in her memory, giving it the shape and the weight it was supposed to have. And when she reached the final passage, she changed it. Not drastically, not in a way that would be obvious to anyone who hadn't studied the composition carefully, but she held the middle note in the third measure exactly the way the woman on the tape had held it, just a fraction longer, with just enough weight. And the chord resolution that followed bloomed open in a way that the version Dante had been playing had never done. It felt like a door opening. She let the last note fade completely before she lifted her hands. The room erupted. She hadn't expected that. She wasn't sure why she hadn't expected it. Perhaps because she had spent so long being invisible in rooms that she had stopped anticipating being seen. But the applause was immediate and genuine and loud, and several people in the front row were on their feet. Imani stood up from the bench. She turned around. Dante had not moved. He was standing exactly where he had been when she sat down, and his expression had changed, tightened into something she could not read at all, something that was not anger and not pleasure, and was not any single emotion she could name. He was looking at her the way you look at something that has just rearranged the furniture of your entire understanding. "Where?" he said, very quietly, under the sound of the applause. "Did you hear that variation?" Imani told him. "The estate box. Indianapolis." The handwritten label. MV, 1987. The stretched tape she had listened to until the recording was nearly gone. Dante's jaw tightened. His mother's initials had been MV Maria Vercelli. She had died in 1994 when Dante was 12 years old, of what the family had publicly described as a sudden illness. The recording had been made 7 years before her death. He had not known it existed. He had also not known that the variation in the final passage, the one his mother had played differently from the published score, the one he had never been able to figure out from the sheet music she'd left behind because she had never written it down, was sitting inside the memory of a 28-year-old woman who had found a cardboard box in a hotel corridor in Indiana 11 years ago. He looked at Imani Brooks for a long moment. "Come to my office," he said, "tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. He walked back to the piano without waiting for her answer, sat down, and began to play the final passage again, with the variation. It sounded, for the first time in over 30 years, the way his mother had intended it to sound. Nobody laughed at Imani again that night. Not even Greer, who had suddenly found the far side of the room very interesting and had not looked in her direction since Dante had raised that single hand. Imani collected her cart from the corridor. She finished her shift. She rode the service elevator down to the basement level, clocked out, changed out of her uniform, and walked out through the loading dock into the cold November air. She stood there for a minute before she started walking to the bus stop. $43 in her checking account. Rent due in 9 days. A meeting scheduled for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning with a man who ran half of Chicago's Gold Coast and controlled the other half through methods that nobody talked about openly. She pulled her coat tighter and walked. The bus ride home took 40 minutes. Imani sat near the back, her coat still damp from the loading dock cold, her cart return receipt folded in her jacket pocket alongside her timesheet. The city moved past the windows in orange and gray, streetlights, closed storefronts, the occasional restaurant still lit up at this hour. She watched it without really seeing it. She kept thinking about his face. Not the moment when she said it, not that particular second when the ballroom went silent, and she understood, with the clarity of someone who has just stepped off a ledge, that she could not take it back. She kept thinking about after, when she played the variation. When the middle note held and the resolution opened and she heard, in the acoustic bloom of that Steinway in that room, exactly what the woman on the tape had been reaching for. Dante Vercelli's expression in that moment had been the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on a man who was clearly very practiced at not being unguarded. She didn't know what to do with that. She also didn't know what to do with the 9 o'clock meeting. She turned it over the whole ride home, the whole walk from the bus stop to her apartment building. The whole time she was unlocking her door and filling a glass of water in the kitchen and sitting down on the edge of her bed without taking her coat off. "Come to my office. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. He hadn't phrased it as a question. She understood that. Men like Dante Vercelli did not phrase invitations as questions because they had stopped needing to some time ago. What she didn't understand was what the invitation meant, whether it was an opportunity or a warning dressed up to look like one. She set her alarm for 7:15 and lay down on top of her covers without changing her clothes. She did not sleep particularly well. The Vercelli Grand's administrative offices occupied the entire 14th floor, and they looked nothing like the hotel below them. Down in the lobby and the ballroom and the corridors where guests moved, everything was marble and warm lighting and the kind of studied elegance that communicated money without appearing to try. Up here, on the 14th floor, the elegance was of a different kind, quieter, less decorative, the kind that came from old furniture that was actually old rather than manufactured to look it. Imani arrived at 8:57 and told the woman at the reception desk she had a 9 o'clock with Mr. Vercelli. The woman, young, dark-haired, with the particular composure of someone who had learned to give nothing away, looked at her for exactly 1 second before picking up the phone. Imani was aware of what she looked like. She had put on the best thing she owned that could reasonably be called professional. A dark green blazer she'd bought secondhand 2 years ago, black slacks, shoes that were close enough to formal that she hoped they'd pass. She had her natural hair pinned back. She looked clean and presentable and like someone who was making an effort, which was different from looking like someone who belonged in this office. She had decided, on the bus ride over, that she was going to stop caring about that particular distinction. It had never served her before. It wasn't going to start now. "He'll see you," the receptionist said, and stood up to lead her back. Dante's office was large without being theatrical about it. One wall was mostly window, looking out over the city. The desk was old mahogany, the surface clear except for a single legal pad and a pen and a cup of coffee that was probably going cold. There were no family photos. There was one painting, abstract, dark blues and greens, and one shelf of books that looked red rather than decorative. Dante was standing at the window when she came in. He turned when he heard her, and she registered, in the flat morning light, that he looked like someone who also had not slept particularly well. He gestured toward the chair across from the desk. She sat. He sat. He did not offer her coffee, which she noted, not as an offense, just as information about what kind of meeting this was going to be. "Tell me about the recording," he said. No preamble. No acknowledgement of the night before. Just that. So she told him. All of it, the way she'd already sketched it. The estate liquidation box in the Indianapolis hotel corridor, the 3 recordings she'd taken, the handwritten label. She described the tape itself, the way the recording had a quality of being made in a domestic space rather than a studio, the slight ambient sound of what might have been a window or a radiator. She told him she'd listened to it until the tape degraded and then transcribed the notes from memory. Dante was very still the entire time she spoke. When she finished, he said, "The label said MV." "Yes." "And the date was 1987. "Yes." He looked at the window for a moment, then back at her. "My mother's name was Maria Vercelli. She made recordings at home. I didn't know any of them had survived outside the family." Imani didn't say anything. She waited. "The variation you played," he said. The way she held that note. "I've been trying to figure that out from her sheet music for 20 years. She never wrote it down." "It's not something you can write down exactly," Imani said. "It's a feeling about the timing. You have to hear it to know where it lives." Dante looked at her with that same complicated expression from the night before, the one she still couldn't fully name. "You heard it once, 11 years ago, and you still remembered it exactly." "I heard it several hundred times," Imani said. "The tape lasted about 2 years before it was too degraded to use. I listened to it as often as I could while I had it." "Why?" The question surprised her, not its content. She understood why he was asking, but the directness of it. She considered giving him a partial answer, then she decided against it. "Because it was the first piece of music I ever heard that sounded like something I recognized," she said. "Not a song I'd heard before. Something I recognized in here." She touched her sternum briefly. "I didn't know what to do with that except listen to it again." Dante said nothing for several seconds. "I want to find the recording," he said finally, "or whatever remains of it. And I want to know if my mother made others. The family archive has been in storage for 15 years. Nobody has properly cataloged it. There are boxes of sheet music, personal papers, audio recordings. Nobody has touched most of it." "You want someone to go through it?" Imani said. I want you to go through it. Imani held his gaze. I'm a hotel housekeeper. You're a person who identified a musical variation that nobody in my family has been able to locate in 30 years, Dante said. The title on your employment file is irrelevant to me. She thought about the $43. The rent. She thought about what Marcus was going to say when she didn't show up for her scheduled shift. What does the job pay? She said. Dante named a number. It was 4 times what she made hourly at the hotel. She kept her face neutral. When would I start? Today, if you're available. She was available. She was going to be available as soon as she texted Marcus, which she was going to do in the elevator on the way down, which was going to be an uncomfortable conversation, but Marcus had made 3 jokes about her weight in the last 6 weeks, and she was not going to lose sleep over it. I'll need access to the full archive, she said. Not selected materials? Everything. Something shifted in Dante's expression. Not displeasure, something more like reassessment. Everything, he confirmed. And I'll need equipment, a quality audio system for listening to any recordings that are still intact, archival gloves for the paper materials, cataloging software. My assistant will arrange it, Imani nodded once. Then yes, today. The archive was in the hotel's sub-basement level, behind a door that required a keycard. Dante's assistant provided, along with a brief, careful tour of the space. It was a large room, temperature-controlled, which was good for the materials, with steel shelving units running in rows and approximately 40, cardboard and wooden boxes of varying sizes. Imani stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking at it. She had cataloged things before, a small art collection for an estate sale 2 years ago, a private library for a retired professor in Evanston who had paid her cash because he couldn't navigate the internet well enough to hire through an agency. She knew how to organize, how to handle fragile materials, how to build a system from disorder. She did not know what she was going to find in here. She knew, with a certainty she couldn't entirely explain, that it was going to matter. She put on the archival gloves and started with the oldest boxes. She had been working for 3 hours when the door opened. She assumed it was Dante's assistant, a quiet, efficient young man named Carlo who had checked on her once already, and didn't look up from the folder she was examining. There's a system to what I'm doing, said a voice that was not Carlo's. The boxes on the left shelving unit are organized by decade. I'd prefer you not... She looked up. The man standing in the doorway was perhaps 40, with Dante's coloring but a different quality to his face, something sharper, less controlled, with a smile that arrived slightly ahead of whatever was actually happening in his eyes. He was dressed the way men dressed when they wanted you to know they could afford not to think about how they dressed. You must be the housekeeper, he said. The word landed the way it was intended to land. Imani Brooks, she said. And you are? Lucian Vercelli. He stepped into the room, looking at the shelving units with an expression she couldn't quite read. Dante's cousin. I wasn't aware he'd hired outside help for this project. He mentioned the archive needed cataloging. He mentioned it to you. Lucian picked up a folder from this table near the door, one she'd already sorted and labeled, and looked at it without looking at it. Interesting. He hasn't mentioned it to me, and I've been asking about this archive for 3 years. Imani watched him set the folder down in the wrong place. She moved it back without comment. I'm sure Mr. Vercelli has his reasons, she said. I'm sure he does. Lucian looked at her directly for the first time. The smile was still there. You play very well, by the way. Last night. Impressive, for someone without training. The "for someone without training" was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Thank you, Imani said, and went back to the folder she'd been examining. Lucian didn't leave. He moved further into the room, walking the rows of shelving with his hands clasped behind his back, the way people walked through spaces they were considering purchasing. This is family property, he said after a moment. Personal materials. Financial records going back decades, some of them. Letters. Private correspondence. He paused. It concerns me that an outside contractor has unsupervised access to sensitive family documents. Imani looked up. Then perhaps you should raise that concern with Mr. Vercelli. Oh, I will. Lucian stopped near the shelf where she'd placed the financial materials. A separate section, clearly labeled, not yet opened. He looked at it. I certainly will. He smiled at her one more time, the smile with the eyes that didn't quite match it, and walked back out. Imani listened to his footsteps fade down the corridor. Then she sat very still for approximately 30 seconds, working through what had just happened. She didn't like what she came up with. She told Dante about the visit that afternoon, in the brief window when he came down to check her progress. She relayed it factually: Lucian's visit, what he'd said, how he'd looked at the financial materials shelf. Dante's face didn't change. "I'll handle it." "I'm telling you because I think you should know," Imani said, "not because I need you to fix it." He looked at her. "He has access to this floor," she said. "He has access to most of the building. He's family." "Does family mean he can walk into a restricted archive and pick up materials I've already cataloged?" A pause. "No." "Then I'd appreciate knowing whether his access will be adjusted, because if it won't be, I need to change how I'm storing the sensitive materials, and I'll need a second lock on this door." Dante looked at her with that reassessment expression again, the one she was beginning to recognize as the face he made when someone had said something he hadn't anticipated. "I'll have a second lock installed today," he said. "Thank you." He turned to leave, then stopped. "You were not afraid of him." It wasn't a question. "No," Imani said. "Most people are." "I've met men who smile like that before," she said. "The smile isn't for you, it's for themselves." Dante looked at her for a long moment. Then he left without saying anything else. The second lock was installed by 5 o'clock. What Dante did not tell Imani, and what she would not learn until much later, was that Lucian's reaction to hearing about the hire had not been the mild concern he'd performed in the archive room. It had been delivered in Dante's office, behind a closed door, at a volume that his assistant Carlo had heard clearly through the wall while pretending to organize files in the adjacent room. "She's nobody," Lucian had said. "She's a temp worker who got lucky at a party. You're giving her access to 30 years of family financial records because she played a song?" "I'm giving her access to my mother's archive because she knew my mother's music," Dante said. "That's the same thing and you know it." "It's not the same thing. Dante." The way Lucian said his name contained the full weight of a shared history, a claim on something that came before the present. "This woman appeared at your event out of nowhere. She impressed you with something she claims she learned from a recording that conveniently no longer exists. You don't know who she is. You don't know who sent her." "Nobody sent her," Dante said. "She was cleaning the hallway." "You can't know that." "I ran a background check this morning." Dante's voice was flat. "She's exactly who she says she is. She's worked in 7 hotels in the last 10 years. She has no associations with any of our business interests, enemies, or competitors. She has $43 in her bank account, and her rent is due next week. Nobody sent her." A silence. "Then she's a civilian," Lucian said, which is worse. A civilian with access to everything. "She's cataloging sheet music and personal letters. She's in the same room as financial records going back to your father's time, to before your father's time." Another silence, shorter. "I want her gone." "She stays," Dante said. "Dante, she stays." The shift in Dante's voice was apparently minimal. Carlo said later that it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "And you'll leave her alone in that archive. Are we clear?" Carlo had stopped pretending to organize files at that point and stood very still. "We're clear," Lucian said. His voice had gone smooth and unreadable, which Carlo, who had worked for this family for 6 years, knew was significantly more concerning than when Lucian was angry. The door had opened, and Lucian had walked out past Carlo's desk without looking at him, and Carlo had watched him go and made a private, careful note to himself to pay close attention to the next several weeks. 3 days into the archive work, Imani began to understand the shape of what she was dealing with. Maria Vercelli had been organized in the way that people who live with a lot of interior life become organized, not immediately legible to anyone else, but internally consistent once you understood the system. Her sheet music was arranged not alphabetically or chronologically, but by something that seemed to be emotional category. Her correspondence was filed by relationship rather than date. Her personal journals, 4 of them, covering the years 1984 through 1993, were written in a mixture of Italian and English that shifted languages mid-sentence in ways that seemed to track the emotional register of what she was writing. Imani couldn't read Italian. She made a note of the journals and moved on, building the catalog, working through the boxes methodically. She found the first recording on day 4. It was a small cassette tape in a plastic case, unlabeled, inside a shoebox of miscellaneous materials from 1989. She logged it, set it aside with the other audio materials for the equipment Dante had provided, and kept working. She found the second recording on day 5. Also unlabeled, also cassette, also 1989. She found the third on day 6. This one was labeled. Not with MV and a date, the way the Indianapolis recording had been. This one had a strip of masking tape across the case with 2 words written on it in the same handwriting she'd been seeing all week on Maria's correspondence. For Dante. Imani held the tape for a long time without moving. She set it in the separate section she'd designated for materials requiring Dante's personal attention, documented it in the catalog with a note, and kept working. She did not tell him about it that day. She waited until the following morning when he came down for his daily check-in, and she placed the catalog entry in front of him and said, "There's something you need to see." Dante looked at the entry. She watched his face. He sat down on the edge of the archive table, not in a chair, just sat down, like someone who needed to not be standing. He looked at the description for a long time. Then he said, "Will you play it with me?" Not will you play it for me, with me. "Yes," Imani said. They listened to it in the archive room on the portable system Carlo had set up. It was 23 minutes long. Maria's voice appeared only once, at the very beginning. She said something in Italian that Imani didn't understand, and Dante translated afterward, quietly, as, "She said she made this for the day I was old enough to understand it." Then the piano. The same composition Imani had heard in Indianapolis, played in the same living space with the same ambient sound of a house around it, but in a different arrangement, slower, more deliberate, as though Maria were teaching rather than performing. She played each section twice. In between sections, her voice appeared again, still in Italian, and Dante's jaw worked while he listened. When it was over, Imani stopped the tape. The silence in the archive room was the kind that forms around grief. "She explains the variation," Dante said, eventually. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, stripped down, rough at the edges. In the sections where she speaks between movements, she says the published score was her first version. What she plays on the recordings is what the piece became after. She says some music takes years to understand what it's trying to be. Imani didn't say anything. She says she hid the recordings because she didn't want anyone in the family to hear them until the time was right. He stopped. "She says she'll know when the time is right." Another silence. "She died the following year," Imani said carefully. "Yes." "So she didn't get to tell you?" "No." Dante stood up. His hands were in his pockets, and his face had closed back down into the controlled expression he wore like a professional garment. But something around his eyes hadn't caught up yet. "She didn't." Imani reached over and stopped the recording system. She began making notes in the catalog. She gave him space without making it obvious that she was doing so. After a moment, Dante said, "You're good at this." She glanced up. "Not the cataloging," he said. "Although you are. I mean..." He stopped. Tried again. "You don't push. You don't seem like someone who responds well to being pushed. Most people do it anyway." "Most people have something to gain from it," Imani said. "I just want to finish the catalog." He looked at her, the reassessment expression. "Is that true?" he said. "That's all you want?" She met his eyes. "I want to finish what I started. I want to know what else is in those boxes. And I want to know whether the rest of these recordings sound the way the one from Indianapolis sounded." Which was how? "Like someone who understood something that most people spend their whole lives looking for," Imani said, "and found it." Dante was quiet for a long moment. "Come to dinner," he said. "Tonight. There are things about my mother I want to understand, and I think you've spent more time with her music in the last week than anyone in my family has in 30 years. Imani considered this. "Dinner with you and your family?" "Dinner with me," he said. "Just me." She noted the clarification. She decided not to comment on it. 7 o'clock, she said. 7 o'clock. She did not find out until later that Lucian had been watching the security footage from the archive corridor. Not doing anything with it. Not yet. Just watching. Logging the hours she arrived and left, noting which boxes she was working through. She also didn't know that Lucian had placed a call that evening to a man named Rafferty, who handled certain categories of problem for the Vercelli organization that were not discussed in meetings, and that the conversation had been brief and had contained, at the end of it, the following instruction. Find out everything. I want her history going back to childhood. I want to know who she is and who she knows and whether there's anything there I can use. She didn't know any of this. What she knew was that the archive contained one more thing she hadn't told anyone about yet. She had found it on day 6, in the same box as the For Dante recording, tucked inside the back cover of a folder labeled Household Accounts, 1991 to 1993, in someone's handwriting that was emphatically not Maria's. The handwriting was smaller, more angular, with the specific controlled quality of someone writing carefully rather than naturally. Inside the folder's back cover, folded 3 times into a rectangle the size of a playing card, was a single sheet of paper. It was a page from a ledger, not a photocopy, an original page, torn carefully from its binding, with columns of numbers and dates and account codes. The accounts were not household accounts. The amounts were not household amounts. And in the margin, in Maria's handwriting, were 2 words, Lucian's father. Imani had looked at that page for a very long time. Then she had refolded it exactly as she'd found it, placed it back in the folder cover, and continued cataloging as though nothing had happened. She had not logged it in the catalog. She needed to understand what she was looking at before she decided what to do with it, because what she thought she was looking at, if she was right, meant that something had been buried in this archive for 30 years, that someone with the smile before the eyes and the Vercelli name was very much counting on staying buried. And if she was right about that, she needed to be very careful. Because the man watching the security footage in the corridor outside already knew she was in the room with it, and he was the kind of man who noticed when people found things they weren't supposed to find. And Imani Brooks had spent her entire life being underestimated by exactly that kind of man, which was the only advantage she currently had, and she was not going to waste it. She placed the folder back in its designated box. She wrote the box number in her catalog under a general heading that would tell Dante she'd been through it and tell no one else anything at all. She put her archival gloves away, locked the archive, pocketed both keys, and went upstairs to get ready for dinner. The restaurant Dante chose was not the kind of place that appeared in guides. It occupied the ground floor of a building on a narrow street in the River North neighborhood, with no sign outside except a street number and a single light above the door. The maitre d' knew Dante by name and walked them to a corner table that had been set for 2 before they arrived, which meant someone had called ahead, which meant Dante had decided on this particular table in this particular restaurant before he asked her to dinner. Imani noted this and filed it. The table was positioned so that Dante sat with his back to the wall and a clear view of the door. She noticed this too, the unconscious architecture of a man who had learned a long time ago to always know what was coming. She sat across from him and opened her menu and did not comment on any of it. They ordered. The waiter disappeared. A bread basket arrived. Dante did not reach for the bread. He looked at her across the table with the directness of someone who had been doing a thing one way for a very long time and was trying to work out whether there was another way. My mother trained in Milan, he said, before she married my father. She was accepted at the conservatory there at 17, graduated at 21. Her professor told my uncle she had the technique of someone twice her age and the instinct of someone who had been playing since before she could walk. She was gifted, Imani said. She was exceptional, Dante said. My father's family didn't use that word, but that's what she was. She stopped performing publicly after she married. That was the expectation. He picked up his water glass. She kept teaching herself, though, kept recording. I didn't know how much until this week. Imani cut a piece of bread. Did you study with her when you were young? Until I was 10. Then she said I had enough technique to continue on my own, and she stopped teaching me directly. He paused. I thought at the time it meant she was done with my progress. Later I understood she was protecting the time she had for her own work. Was she right, that you had enough to continue alone? Probably not. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile. I compensated with discipline. Is that why the final passage sounds controlled? Imani said. You learned it from the sheet music, the published version, so it became about technical precision rather than what she was trying to say with it. Dante was quiet for a moment. Yes. That's not a criticism, Imani said. You didn't have the recording. You worked with what you had. It's accurate, which is more useful than not being a criticism. He looked at her steadily. You say things like that without softening them. Does it bother you? No. He said it simply, without qualification. Everyone around me softens everything. I'd forgotten what the other things sounded like. Their food arrived. They ate for a while in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Imani had learned the difference a long time ago. Uncomfortable silences had a specific pressure to them, a demand that you fill them. This one didn't have that quality. She was trying to work out how to tell him about the ledger page. She had been working it out since she found it. She knew what she thought it was. She was not naive about the kinds of financial arrangements that could run beneath a family organization like this one, and 2 words in a dead woman's handwriting in the margin of a torn ledger page said enough to construct the shape of it. Theft. Years of it. Hidden by someone who had then died before she could expose it, and then apparently continued by the thief's son, who was now a senior member of the organization and had been asking about this archive for 3 years. She knew what she thought it was. What she didn't know was how much Dante knew, how much he might be protecting even without realizing it, how the information would land when it came from her, an outsider, a woman who had been in this family's archive for 6 days. She also didn't know, and this was the part that concerned her most, what Lucian was likely to do when he figured out she'd found it. He would figure it out. That was the thing. Not because she'd done anything wrong. She'd been careful. She'd covered the entry. She'd given nothing away. But Lucian was watching the footage, and Lucian knew the archive, and Lucian had been here long enough to understand what was in those boxes better than anyone had admitted to her. He would work through it. It was only a matter of time. "I need to tell you something about the archive," Imani said. Dante put his fork down. The shift in his attention was immediate and complete. She had noticed this about him over the past week. He had the ability to stop doing one thing entirely and do another, without any bleed between them. It was a trained quality, she thought, or a survival quality. Maybe both. "I found a document," she said. "On day 6. I didn't catalog it because I wanted to understand what I was looking at before I made any decisions." She described it precisely. The folder, the location, the way it had been folded and tucked into the back cover rather than filed normally. The fact that the handwriting on the outer label was not Maria's while the margin notation clearly was. She described the amounts. She had memorized them, because that was what she did. And the account codes, which she had been quietly researching in the evenings using the access to financial data that Dante's catalog commission had given her. She described the 2 words in the margin. Dante's face did not change. Not a single visible thing shifted. His hands were on the table and they remained still. She finished and stopped talking and waited. "How certain are you?" he said. His voice had a new quality. Not anger, not grief. Something more mechanical. The voice of a man running calculations. "The account codes trace to shell structures in Delaware and Cyprus," Imani said. "I couldn't get to the beneficial ownership without access I don't have. But the pattern of the amounts and the intervals matches what I found in a separate set of household ledgers from 1993. There are corresponding withdrawals from the household accounts that don't match any documented expenses. Somebody was moving money through the family's operational finances and using the household accounts as a transit point to obscure the trail." "How much?" Dante said. "From the 1991 to 1993 records alone? Approximately 4 million. Your mother documented it over roughly 18 months. But those are only the records I've seen so far. The archive has materials going back to the early 1980s that I haven't worked through yet." Dante said nothing. "Your mother found it," Imani said. "Based on the dates in the margin notes and the timeline of when she started hiding the recordings, I think she found it in early 1993. She died in 1994. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence earlier in the meal. "She hid evidence inside the music," Dante said. It wasn't a question. I was working through it, out loud, in the controlled way of someone who processed by articulating. "The sheet music annotations," Imani said. "I didn't understand them at first. They looked like performance markings, dynamics, tempo. But some of them correspond to dates and numbers in the ledger page. I think she was encoding the records into the compositions, in case something happened to the paper documents." Dante picked up his water glass and set it down again without drinking from it. "She thought something might happen." "I think she was afraid," Imani said. "Yes." Another silence. "Lucian's father," Dante said. "That's what the notation said. His father died in 1997. Dante's voice was completely flat now. Heart attack. He was 62. He had been my father's second for 20 years. He stopped. Lucian took his position when he was 25. Imani kept her eyes on Dante's face. He was not, she observed, surprised in the way that people were surprised when information came from nowhere. He was surprised in the specific way of someone who has been refusing to form a suspicion and has just been presented with evidence that the suspicion was correct. "How long have you known something was wrong?" she said. His jaw tightened briefly. "I haven't known anything. There have been discrepancies, small ones, in the last few years. I had my accountant's audit twice. The audits came back clean. If the shell structures go back 30 years, there are people inside those structures who know how to pass an audit," Imani said. "And if Lucian has been managing those accounts since his father died, he's had 25 years to build in the right kinds of clean." Dante looked at her across the table. Something in his expression had gone very careful, very still, in the way of a man making a decision about how much to reveal. She recognized it because she was in the middle of making a similar decision herself. "This is why he wants you out of the archive," Dante said. "Yes. He knows what's in those boxes. Or he knows what might be. He's been asking about the archive for 3 years, you said. He's known all along that the records from that period were in there. He just didn't have a reason to be concerned about them until someone started actually going through them. Until someone started going through them with the specific kind of attention that would find something hidden inside sheet music." "Yes." Dante leaned back slightly in his chair. His hands were still on the table. "And now he's concerned." "He's more than concerned," Imani said. "He came into the archive the second day. He looked directly at the financial materials section. He knows I'm building a complete catalog, and he knows that means eventually I'm going to work through everything." She paused. "I want you to understand that this is not a comfortable position for me." "I understand that." "I don't think you fully do," she said. "I'm an outside contractor who has been in your family archive for 6 days. I found evidence that suggests a senior member of your organization has been stealing from you for years and may have had prior knowledge of your mother's death. If I report that to you officially, through the catalog process, Lucian finds out within 24 hours that I've flagged it, and I think you know what that means." Dante said nothing. "I'm not saying that to pressure you," Imani said. "I'm saying it because I need you to understand that I need to know right now whether you're going to protect the information or whether you're going to let family considerations make this complicated." A long moment. "Family considerations," Dante said quietly. "He's your cousin." "Yes. So I need to know." Dante looked at her for a long time. The restaurant moved around them. Low sound of other conversations, the soft percussion of a kitchen, and he sat in it without moving. "I will protect the information," he said, "and I will protect you." "I don't need to be protected," Imani said. "I need the information handled correctly. Those are different things." Another of those reassessment pauses. Then, "Yes, you're right, they are. So what do you want to do?" "I want to see the full picture before I do anything," Dante said, "which means I need you to keep working, carefully, without Lucian knowing you've found anything." "I've already been doing that." "I know." He looked at her with something that was, she thought, the closest thing to an unguarded expression she had yet seen from him. "You've been doing this since day 6, and you didn't tell me until you understood what you had. That's either very careful or very calculating, and I can't decide which." "Both," Imani said. "Is that a problem?" He thought about it. Genuinely, it seemed, not performing consideration, but actually sitting with it. "No," he said. She nodded once. They finished dinner. 2 weeks passed. Imani kept working. She developed, during those 2 weeks, a specific discipline around the financial materials. She worked through them in a sequence that would look, on the security footage Lucian was watching, like the ordinary progression of a thorough cataloger. She left the most sensitive sections for last and approached them the way you approach the edge of something you couldn't see the bottom of, carefully, with both feet on solid ground before you leaned. Dante came to the archive each morning. Their conversations had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to anyone watching, but there was a quality to them now that hadn't been there before. The quality of two people who had exchanged a specific kind of information and were each adjusting to what that meant. He brought her coffee once, without being asked. She thanked him without making anything of it. He stayed longer than his usual check-in time, looking over the catalog entries she'd completed, asking occasional questions about specific items. She noticed that he was, in these sessions, learning his mother, learning the shape of her organization, the way she thought, the logic of her system. He didn't say this. He didn't need to. She watched him reading Maria's handwriting and understood what was happening on his face. On the Thursday of the second week, Lucian came back. She was alone in the archive when the door opened, and she recognized his footstep by then, slightly heavier on the right side, unhurried in the way of someone who was performing unhurriedness rather than feeling it. She did not look up from what she was working on. "You're still here," he said. She made a note in the catalog. He came into the room. She heard him moving toward the financial materials section, and she kept writing. "How far along are you?" he said. "Through 1989, working chronologically." A pause. "That's slower than I'd have expected. Paper materials from this period require a lot of care. The condition of some of the folders is poor." "Right." He moved a little closer. "The financial records. Those are still toward the back of the sequence?" "Yes." "When do you expect to reach them?" She looked up then. Just a brief look, measured and neutral. "A few more weeks." "Why?" Lucian smiled. "Family records. I'm interested in being present when the more sensitive materials are reviewed. For context." "You'd want to check that with Mr. Vercelli," Imani said. "He established the access protocols." "Of course." He kept smiling. "I'll do that." He left. She waited 5 minutes, then went upstairs and told Dante what had been said. Dante was on a call. He held up one finger, finished the call in 30 seconds, hung up, and gave her his full attention. She relayed the conversation exactly. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's escalating his timeline." "Yes." "Because he's figured out you're further along than you're saying." "Possibly. Or because he's running out of patience." She paused. "Or because someone told him." Dante looked at her sharply. "Carlo has access to the catalog files," Imani said carefully. "I'm not saying Carlo told him anything. I'm saying the system has more access points than you might want right now." Dante picked up his phone, then set it back down. "I'll move the active catalog files to a closed drive today." "Good." "Is there anything you need me to do?" he said. "Don't change anything that would tell Lucian you've been warned," Imani said. "Whatever you do with the drive, make it look administrative, routine." He nodded slowly. "You think like someone who has had to be careful for a long time." "I have had to be careful for a long time," Imani said. He looked at her. Something passed across his face that might have been the beginning of an apology, or might have been something else. He didn't say what it was. "Finish the coffee section today," he said. "I'll handle Lucian." She went back downstairs. What Dante said to Lucian that afternoon was not relayed to Imani. What she did know, because she heard part of it through the archive ceiling, which conducted sound from the office above with uncomfortable clarity, was that the conversation was short, and that Lucian's voice was in it twice and Dante's once, and that the once was quiet enough that she couldn't make out words. What she also knew, because Carlo mentioned it to her with careful casualness the following morning while refilling the archive's supply of archival gloves, was that Lucian had been on his phone almost continuously for the past 18 hours, and that 2 of the calls had been to men whose names Carlo mentioned as though they were neutral information and which landed in Imani's memory as something she was going to look into. She looked into them that evening on her laptop in her apartment. Both men were lawyers. One was a corporate attorney with offices in the Loop who handled business restructuring. The other was a name she had to search more carefully to find, and when she found it, it was in a 3-year-old article in a legal trade publication about a case involving asset protection in complex family trust structures. She sat with that for a while. Then she went back to what she'd been building since the first week. The complete picture, assembled piece by piece from the archive materials, the account codes, the financial records, the margin notes in Maria's handwriting. She had most of it now. Not all. The pre-1989 materials were still in boxes she hadn't fully processed, and she suspected, based on the pattern of what she'd found in the 1991 to 1993 records, that the earliest transactions were in there, the originating accounts, the proof of when it had started. She needed 3 more days in the archive to get there. She wasn't sure she had 3 more days. The morning she found the second ledger page was a Thursday, gray and cold, with a wind coming off the lake that had been rattling the hotel's upper windows since dawn. She had been in the archive since 7:30, earlier than usual, something restless in her having kept her from sleeping past 6. She was working through a box of materials from 1986 and 1987, the earliest she'd accessed so far, moving carefully through folders of household records and correspondence, and what appeared to be drafts of letters that had never been sent. The second ledger page was in the same configuration as the first, folded precisely, tucked into the back cover of a folder, hidden in plain sight among materials that would look, to a casual search, like ordinary household records. It was older than the first one, more fragile. The ink had faded in places. But it wasn't the page itself that stopped her breath. It was what was written on the back of it. The front was another set of account codes and amounts, the beginning of the trail she'd been tracing. She noted these and turned it over with her gloved hands, and on the back, in Maria's handwriting, smaller here, more compressed, like someone writing in a space they weren't sure they had, were not 2 words but 12. If something happens to me, the music tells the story. Play it for Dante. Imani sat completely still. The ambient sound of the temperature control system, the faint hum of the portable audio equipment in the corner. Nothing else. She had known, in the abstract, that Maria had been afraid. She had known, in the intellectual way you could know something without letting it be fully real, that the circumstances of Maria's death, sudden, unexplained, 1 year after she had begun documenting evidence of theft, had a shape that was difficult to look at directly. This made it fully real. She refolded the page. Her hands were steady. She was aware of them being steady in a way that felt slightly separate from the rest of her, like the steadiness was a thing her body had decided to maintain without consulting her. She placed it with the first page, in the false bottom of the archival supply case she'd been using as a secure location, the only location in the archive room that the security camera couldn't see, which she had identified on her first day and had been building toward ever since. She stood up. She needed to tell Dante. She needed to tell him now, not at the regular morning check-in, not after she'd processed and considered. Now, because the shape of what she understood had just changed completely, and she was sitting in a room that Dante Vercelli had been watching for weeks, and she had been careful enough, patient enough, precise enough, and now she needed to be fast. She was halfway to the door when it opened. Not Carlo, not Dante. Lucian. He was not smiling this time. He had 2 men with him that she had not seen before. Not hotel staff, not anyone she recognized from the regular Vercelli operation. They stood slightly behind him and to either side and did not look directly at her, which was, she understood with the flat clarity of adrenaline, its own kind of message. "Ms. Brooks," Lucian said. His voice had the quality she'd noticed that first day. Smooth, unreadable. But underneath it now was something that hadn't been there before. Something tight. "Mr. Vercelli," she said. She kept her body between him and the supply case without making it obvious that she was doing this. "I need to ask you to step away from the archive today," he said. "We've had a concern raised about some missing items from the hotel's inventory. Management has asked that all contractor spaces be temporarily secured while we conduct an internal review." It was very good, she thought, constructed quickly but with real craft. Missing inventory, internal review, contractor spaces. All of it was designed to sound procedural, to invoke an authority she couldn't immediately challenge, to give her no obvious grounds to refuse without looking like she had a reason to refuse. She looked at him steadily. "I'd need to hear that from Mr. Dante Vercelli directly." Lucian's smooth expression flickered, just once, just briefly. "Dante is unavailable this morning." "Then I'll wait until he's available." A silence. "Ms. Brooks." Lucian stepped into the room, and the 2 men behind him moved, not dramatically, not in any way she could point to, but they were now positioned differently than they had been 10 seconds ago. "I think you should understand that this isn't a request." Imani felt the specific calibration of the moment, its components, its weight, its probable trajectories, with the speed of someone who had spent a lifetime reading rooms. The archive door was behind Lucian. The supply case was behind her. Her phone was in her jacket pocket. She had sent Dante a message at 7:45 to tell him she was starting early. She did not know if he had read it. "All right," she said. Lucian's expression relaxed fractionally. I'll need to secure the materials I'm currently working with, she said. Archival protocol requires that open folders be properly stored before the workspace is left. It takes 5 minutes. You're welcome to watch. She turned back to the table before he could object, moving with the deliberate calm of someone performing a routine task. With her back to the room, facing the shelving unit, she pulled out her phone. She typed 4 words. Archive. Now. Please. She hit send. She placed the phone back in her pocket and began the methodical, slow, loudly routine process of returning folders to their proper boxes, buying herself the only currency she had in this moment: time. Her hands were still steady. Lucian stood in the middle of the archive room, watching her and waiting, and she could feel his patience running out with the precision of a clock. She couldn't see, but could absolutely hear, and somewhere above her head in this building was either a man who was going to walk through that door in the next 4 minutes, or a man who was not. And the difference between those two possibilities was the difference between everything she'd built in the last 3 weeks and nothing at all. And she folded a piece of tissue paper around a fragile folder with complete and absolute care and set it in its designated box and reached for the next one. The 4th folder was still in her hands when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Not 1 set. 2. She kept folding the tissue paper around the folder's spine with the same careful pressure, the same measured movements, and she listened to the footsteps the way she had learned to listen to things, not with her attention visibly directed toward them, but with her whole body tuned like an instrument receiving a frequency. The first set was heavier, faster. The second was lighter, slightly irregular, like someone moving quickly while trying not to appear to be moving quickly. Dante's footsteps she knew by now. That was his. The other she didn't recognize. The door opened hard. Not violently. Dante didn't do things violently, she had come to understand. But it opened with a force that communicated his awareness of exactly what he was walking into, and he came through it and read the room in under 2 seconds. Imani at the shelving unit, her back to the space. Lucian in the center of the room, hands clasped. The 2 men near the door, positioned wrong for casual standing. His eyes went to the 2 men first. Out, he said. Neither man moved immediately. They looked at Lucian. That was the moment, the 1-second gap between Dante's instruction and their compliance, that told Imani everything she needed to know about how far this had already gone. Then Lucian made a small movement with his hand, just a slight tilt of his wrist, and the 2 men walked out. Dante watched them go. The door was still open. He did not close it. Lucian, he said. There was a concern about inventory, Lucian said. His voice was still smooth, still constructed, but the construction was showing its seams now, the way a well-made thing showed stress when the weight on it exceeded its design. I was asking Ms. Brooks to step out temporarily. I got a message from Ms. Brooks at 7:58, Dante said. It said archive now, please. He looked at his cousin without blinking. You want to tell me what was happening in here that made her feel she needed to send that? A pause. I explained the situation. What situation? The inventory concern I just told you. There is no inventory concern, Dante said. I checked with management on my way down. Nobody filed anything. Lucian's jaw shifted, almost imperceptibly. It may not have been formally logged yet. Lucian? Dante's voice didn't rise. It dropped, which was somehow more difficult to be in the presence of. Stop. The word landed in the room like something solid. Imani had placed the last folder in its box. She turned around slowly, giving them the space to have this in front of her, which was where it needed to happen. Lucian looked at her. The smooth expression was gone. What was underneath it was harder to look at. Not rage exactly. Something colder. The face of a man who has been running a calculation for a long time and has just watched one of the variables change. She's been in this archive for 3 weeks, Lucian said. He was talking to Dante but looking at Imani. You don't know her. You don't know who she is. You brought a stranger into the most sensitive records your family owns because she played a song at a party. I know who she is, Dante said. You know what she showed you. Lucian turned to face him now, and something shifted in how he was standing. The body language of a man who has decided to commit. She's working you, Dante. Whatever she's told you about what she's found in here, whatever story she's built, she's telling you what you want to hear because she wants access to this family and you handed it to her on a piano bench. Imani said nothing. Dante said nothing. Send her away, Lucian said. Pay her off, give her a check, let her go. Whatever she's told you she found in here, let me review it first. I know these records. I've known them for 20 years. Let me verify what she's claiming before you act on any of it." The room was very quiet. Dante looked at his cousin for a long time. Imani watched Dante's face and understood, in that moment, what was actually being asked. Not for a review of the records, for the chance to get into the room alone with the materials before anyone who didn't have a stake in them could build a complete picture. It was elegant, she thought. Wrapped in the language of caution and family protection, it was asking for exactly the thing that would make everything disappear. "What are you afraid I found?" Imani said. Both men looked at her. She kept her voice level. "You've been in here twice in 3 weeks. You've been watching the security footage. You've been asking about access to this archive for 3 years. What is it specifically that you don't want anyone to see?" Lucian's face went very still. "Be very careful," he said quietly. "I'm always careful," Imani said. "That's not an answer." "Imani." Dante said her name. Not a warning, just placing himself in the conversation, reminding her he was there. "He came in here with 2 men and told me it wasn't a request," she said to Dante, keeping her eyes on Lucian. "I need you to understand what that means." A silence that had weight. Lucian looked at Dante. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to something almost conversational, almost gentle, which was the most alarming version of Lucian's voice she had yet heard. "This is what I'm talking about. She's driving a wedge. That's what she does. 3 weeks and she's already got you questioning your own family. You came into this room with 2 men, Dante said, while she was alone. I came to ask her to step out. With 2 men, Dante said again. Another silence. Go upstairs, Dante said to Lucian. Wait in my office. Dante. Go upstairs. The drop in his voice again. Now. Lucian looked at Imani one more time. The look had no warmth in it, no performance, no constructed smoothness. It was a look that communicated, with complete clarity and no ambiguity, that this was not over and that he understood the difference between a delay and a defeat. Then he turned and walked out. Dante waited until his footsteps had moved far enough down the corridor that they were gone. Then he closed the archive door. He turned to face Imani. Are you all right? Yes. She meant it. Her hands had been steady the entire time and were still steady. But we're out of time. Whatever we're going to do, it needs to happen before he has any opportunity to access these materials independently. Agreed. Dante was already thinking. She could see it in the way he moved, the way he stood, the brain behind the controlled face working at speed. What do you need? I need 48 hours to complete the documentation, she said. Full photographic copies of the ledger pages, cross-referenced with every corresponding record in the archive. I need to build a complete chain of evidence that can stand up to scrutiny from someone who isn't you. Meaning someone outside the organization. Meaning investigators, she said. Dante. This goes outside your organization, or it disappears. You understand that? His jaw was tight. Yes. If you handle it internally, Lucian has people who will make the records complicated. He's been doing this for 20 years and his father did it before him. They know how to make things complicated. I know. So you need to decide right now whether you're willing to hand this to people who will take it somewhere you can't control. He looked at her. The unguarded quality was there again. Not grief this time, but something adjacent to it. The face of a man confronting the specific weight of a choice that cannot be undone once made. My mother hid evidence of a crime in her music because she was afraid of what would happen if she reported it through the organization, he said. Yes. And she died the following year. Yes. He was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. She counted them. 48 hours, he said. What do you need from me? Keep Lucian occupied. Don't let him near this floor. And get me a secure way to transmit the documentation when it's complete. I'll have a lawyer here by noon. Someone who is specifically not connected to any Vercelli business interests. Good. And Imani. He stopped. Something moved across his face that was difficult to categorize. Not apology, not gratitude, something more uncomfortable than either of those. The 2 men he brought in, they work for him specifically, not for the organization. I need you to understand that I will manage that. All right. It won't happen again. I know, she said. Now go upstairs. You have a conversation to have with your cousin, and you need to have it before he makes any phone calls. Dante left. Imani turned back to the archive. She had 48 hours. She started working. She worked for 11 hours straight. Carlo brought her food at 1 o'clock. A sandwich, coffee, the quiet efficiency of a young man who understood that something had shifted and was responding by being useful. He did not ask questions. She appreciated this about him. By 3 in the afternoon, she had photographed every relevant document and organized the images into a chronological sequence that told the story without requiring any explanation. The ledger pages, the corresponding household accounts, the margin annotations in Maria's handwriting, the sheet music with its encoded system of notations, the recordings that demonstrated Maria's awareness of what she'd found. At 4:30, a woman arrived whom Dante introduced only as his attorney and whose name was Helen Marsh. She was approximately 60, unhurried, with the specific quality of calm that came from decades of being the person in the room who understood the legal terrain better than anyone else present. She shook Imani's hand, looked at the materials Imani had assembled, asked 6 precise questions, and then sat down with a yellow legal pad and began making notes. At 5:45, Dante came back downstairs. He had been with Lucian for most of the day. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the particular tension around his eyes that came from hours of managing something that could not be managed. He stood in the doorway of the archive for a moment, looking at the spread of materials on the table, at Helen Marsh making notes in the corner, at Imani's systematic movement through the remaining boxes. "How did it go?" she said without looking up. "He denied everything," Dante said, categorically. "His performance was—" He stopped. "Convincing, actually. If I didn't have what you'd already shown me, I might have believed him." "He's had a long time to practice," Imani said. "He's also threatening to go to the captains," Dante said. "Several of them. He has relationships I don't have the same level of. He's been cultivating them for years. He's going to tell them that I've brought an outsider into the organization's records and that she's manipulating me and destabilizing the family." "And will the captains listen?" A pause. "Some of them will be open to it." "Yes." Helen Marsh looked up from her legal pad. "How many people have seen the physical documents?" "Currently, you, me, Mr. Vercelli, and Ms. Brooks," Imani said. "Lucian doesn't know the specific nature of what we found. He knows there's something. He doesn't know the details." "We need to move the originals out of this building tonight," Helen said. "I can arrange secure storage through my office." "Agreed," Dante said. "And the transmission to the investigative contacts?" Imani said to Helen. "I have a contact at the federal level," Helen said carefully. "Someone I've worked with before on financial crimes cases. I can make a call tonight off the record to understand the appetite." "Make the call," Dante said. Helen closed her legal pad and took out her phone and walked toward the corner of the room to make the call privately, and Dante came to stand near Imani at the table. He looked at the photographs she had printed, the chain of documentation laid out in sequence. "She knew," he said quietly. "She knew, and she couldn't tell anyone, and she built it into the only thing she had that nobody would take away from her." "The music," Imani said. "Yes." "She was protecting you," Imani said. "The tape labeled for Dante. The note on the second ledger page, play it for Dante. She built the whole system for you to find." "She built it for someone to find," Dante said. "She built it for whoever understood the music well enough to read what she'd hidden in it." Imani was quiet. "She couldn't have known it would be you," he said. "She couldn't have known someone would find that recording in Indiana and learn it well enough to recognize the variation. She couldn't have planned for any of that." "No," Imani said. "But it had to be someone who loved the music," Dante said. "Not someone studying it, someone who loved it, the way she loved it." Imani didn't answer that because it didn't need an answer. Helen came back from the corner. "My contact is interested. He wants a preliminary meeting. Tomorrow." "Where?" Dante said. "Off-site, somewhere neutral." Helen looked between them. "I'd recommend Ms. Brooks be present. She's built the documentary chain. She'll need to be part of the explanation." "I'll be present," Imani said. "There are risks to that," Helen said carefully. "I know what the risks are," Imani said. "I've known what the risks were since day 6. That hasn't changed what I'm doing." Helen looked at her for a moment, then nodded. The meeting with Helen's contact was scheduled for 10 o'clock the following morning at an office in the Loop that didn't have the agency's name on the door. At 9:45, Imani was in a car with Dante and Helen, 2 blocks from the building, when Dante's phone rang. He looked at the screen, said nothing. Let it ring once more, then answered. Lucian, he said. Imani could hear Lucian's voice from where she sat, not words exactly, but the register. High, fast, the particular frequency of someone who has crossed a line they have been standing at the edge of. Dante listened. His face was utterly still. Then he said, Where? He listened again. I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said, and hung up. He looked at Helen first, then at Imani. He's called a meeting of the captains, Dante said. At the hotel, right now. He's told them there's an emergency and that the organization is being compromised from inside. He paused. He wants me there. Alone. Helen said, Don't go. If I don't go, he tells them I'm absent because I'm guilty. He's been building that narrative for 3 weeks. Dante's voice was very controlled. 6 of those captains have been with this organization for 20 years. If Lucian persuades them before I have a chance to present the evidence, we lose half the infrastructure we need to make the legal case work. Witnesses, financial cooperation, the cooperation agreements Helen has been structuring. Dante, Helen said, if he has the captains already. He doesn't have them yet, Dante said. He's calling the meeting because he's running out of time and he knows it. He's trying to get ahead of what we're bringing to the federal contact this morning. He looked at Imani. If I miss that meeting, we lose everything we've built politically inside the organization. If you miss the 10 o'clock, I'll go to the 10 o'clock, Imani said. Both of them looked at her. Helen will be there, she said. I've built the documentary chain. I can present it. That's what they need from the meeting. You'd be doing this without me, Dante said. I've been doing most of this without you, she said. That's not a criticism, that's just true. His jaw tightened. If Lucian figures out where you are, Lucian is going to be in a meeting with you for the next hour, Imani said. That's actually the safest window I'm going to get. A silence. Helen said, She's right. Dante looked at Imani for a long moment. The unguarded quality again. A lot of it this time, more than she'd seen before. The face of a man having a very specific feeling about a situation and not having a word for the feeling. Be careful, he said. Always, she said. He got out of the car. She watched him walk toward the hotel, straight-backed, measured, the professional stillness that was his armor and his inheritance. He didn't look back. The car started moving. The federal contact's name was Whitmore, and he was the least dramatic person she had met in 3 weeks. A man in his early 50s with a plain suit and a yellow notepad, and the specific quality of attention that came from years of listening to people tell him complicated things and sorting what mattered from what didn't. He looked at the documentary chain for 40 minutes without speaking. Then he asked questions, good questions, tight and sequential, building from the earliest documented transaction through to the current state of the archive and the nature of the shell structures. Imani answered each one precisely, without editorializing, without making arguments, just the facts in the order she had assembled them and the connection she had established between them. After an hour, Whitmore sat back. This is enough to open a formal investigation, he said. Based on what you've presented, I can initiate within 48 hours. The physical originals will be in Helen's secure storage by tonight, Imani said. I'll need them transferred to our custody. Helen knows the process. He looked at Imani directly. Ms. Brooks, I want to be clear with you about what this means. Once we formally initiate, this moves outside of Mr. Vercelli's control. It moves outside of your control. The investigation goes where the evidence goes. I understand that, Imani said, including evidence that may concern the broader Vercelli organization's operations. I understand that too, she said. And Mr. Vercelli understands this? He's the one who called Helen, Imani said. He made the decision. Whitmore nodded slowly. He looked back at the documentation. The musical encoding you describe, the sheet music notations. We'll need that decoded completely and verified by an independent musicologist. I can provide a full decoding, Imani said, and I can recommend 2 people with the appropriate credentials to verify it. Whitmore looked at her. You can decode it. I've spent 3 weeks with it, Imani said. Yes. He made a note on his pad. All right. Helen's phone rang. She looked at the screen, then looked at Imani. Something in her face shifted, just slightly. The specific shift of someone receiving information they were expecting but had hoped not to receive. It's Dante, Helen said, and answered. Imani watched Helen's face during the call, watched the controlled, professional expression maintain itself while the eyes behind it did something else. Helen ended the call and put the phone down. "The captain's meeting," she said. Lucian told them that Dante has been working with federal investigators to dismantle the organization from inside, that the woman in the archive is a federal plant, that Dante has been building a case against the organization for 18 months. Whitmore was very still. 4 of the 6 captains walked out with Lucian, Helen said. They've frozen the operational accounts. Dante is in the hotel, and he has his loyal security team, but the 4 captains who left control the external network, suppliers, distributors, the legal businesses that are tied to the operational structure. A silence. "He's dismantling it from outside," Imani said. "In real time," Helen confirmed. "Yes." "How long before the damage is permanent?" Whitmore said. "If 4 of 6 captains are actively working against the organization's structure..." Helen stopped, started again. 48 hours. Maybe less. "If he freezes the right accounts and makes the right calls in the next 2 days, the legal businesses go under, and there's nothing left to cooperate with your investigation." Whitmore looked at Imani. Imani sat with it for exactly the time it took her to understand the full shape of what had just happened. Lucian had not gone to the captain's meeting to defend himself. He had gone to burn everything down. If there was no organization left, there was no financial structure to trace. The shell companies operated independently. Without the domestic business structure to anchor them, the documentary chain she had built became dramatically harder to prosecute. And if Dante lost the loyalty of 4 captains in the next 48 hours, he lost the ability to cooperate in any meaningful way, because the cooperation agreements Helen had been building depended on access to the operational network that those captains controlled. Lucian had found the one move that could neutralize everything, not by defeating them, by destroying the board they were playing on. "I need to get back to Dante," Imani said. "Imani," Helen started. "The musical record," Imani said. "The encoding, the complete decoding. If I can demonstrate the encoding system publicly, not in a legal filing, not in a private meeting, in a way that's immediate and undeniable and in front of people who cannot be selectively told otherwise..." She stopped herself. Worked through it. Looked at the date on Whitmore's notepad. The anniversary gala was in 11 days. The same event, 1 year later, the same room, the same piano, the same 200 guests, politicians, judges, business figures, media, people who wielded the kind of social and legal weight that 4 rogue captains could not simply freeze out of the equation. If Lucian's move was to destroy the structure quietly, in back rooms and phone calls over the next 48 hours, then the counter-move was to not be in a back room. "The gala," she said. Helen understood immediately. Her expression did something complicated. "That's 11 days, Helen said. "I know." "Lucian will have done significant damage in 11 days. "I know." Imani looked at Whitmore. "Can you initiate the investigation in a way that freezes Lucian's external movements? Not the captains, his personal accounts, the shell structures." Whitmore was quiet for a moment. "With what you've given me, I can get emergency asset preservation within 24 hours. It won't stop him moving people, but it limits his financial leverage." "Do that," Imani said. "Today." "And the gala?" Helen said. "I need 11 days to decode the rest of the musical record completely," Imani said. "Every annotation, every hidden measure, the complete chain all the way back to the beginning, encoded into the music." She paused. "And I need the piano." Helen looked at her for a long time. "You're going to walk into that ballroom," Helen said slowly, "in front of 200 people and play a dead woman's music as evidence." "I'm going to play a dead woman's music the way she intended it to be played," Imani said. "That's what she asked for. That's what the note said. Play it for Dante." The room was very quiet. "There will be people in that room who are connected to Lucian," Helen said, "who will do whatever they can to..." "I know," Imani said, "and you're prepared for that." Imani thought about Mafia Vercelli in a house in 1987, recording evidence of a crime onto a cassette tape in the only language she trusted nobody would take from her, trusting that someone, someday, would love the music enough to hear what she had hidden inside it. She thought about a cardboard box in a hotel corridor in Indianapolis. "Yes," she said. She picked up her bag. The window behind Whitmore's desk showed Chicago in November light, gray and absolute and cold, all the way to the horizon. 11 days. She had 11 days to take Maria Vercelli's unfinished story and finish it, in the same room where this had all begun, in front of everyone who needed to hear it, on an instrument that had been waiting for exactly this since the night a housekeeper had stopped in a corridor and listened through a door and heard something the rest of the world had. The 11 days were the hardest work of her life. Not because of the hours. She had worked long hours before, had worked doubles and triples and shifts that bled into each other without natural boundaries. Not because of the material. The musical encoding was intricate, but internally consistent, and once she had fully understood Maria's system, the decoding moved with a logic that felt almost inevitable, like following a path someone had laid carefully and trusted would be found. The hardest part was doing it while everything around her was coming apart. The four captains moved fast. Whitmore's asset preservation order hit Lucian's personal accounts within 22 hours, which slowed his financial leverage but did not stop the damage to the organization's operational structure. By the end of the first week, 2 of the legal hospitality businesses had suspended operations. The distribution network for 3 of Dante's legitimate nightclubs had been quietly strangled, suppliers suddenly unavailable, licenses under review, managers receiving phone calls from people they could not easily say no to. Dante managed it. She watched him manage it the way she had watched him play the piano, with technical precision and without visible emotion, doing what the moment required rather than what he felt. He spent his days on phones and in rooms she wasn't present in, making the calls and having the conversations that were keeping the remaining 2 loyal captains from drifting, keeping Helen's cooperation structure intact, keeping the 11 days from becoming 3. In the evenings, he came to the archive, not to check on her work. He came because the archive was where his mother's voice was, and he had started, in these last weeks, to need that in a way he hadn't allowed himself to need it before. He would sit in the chair near the audio equipment and listen to whichever recording Imani was currently working from, and she would work, and the room held both of them without requiring either of them to address what that meant. On the 6th evening, he said, she recorded 17 pieces. Imani looked up. I counted them last night, he said. 17 separate compositions. Some of them I recognize from when she taught me. Some I've never heard. He looked at the audio equipment. She spent the last years of her life making this archive and nobody knew. She knew someone would find it, Imani said. She hoped, Dante said. That's not the same thing. Imani put down her pen. She encoded 30 months of evidence into the margins and notations of 17 compositions and then hid the recordings in a way that would preserve them through whatever came next. That's not hope. That's engineering. She paused. She was a serious person. Dante was quiet for a moment. Yes. You got that from her, Imani said. The seriousness. He looked at her. She went back to her work without explaining what she'd meant, and he didn't ask her to. On the 9th day, Lucian made contact, not with Dante, with Imani. He sent a message through a number she didn't recognize, to a phone number she hadn't given him, which told her several things at once about the resources he had still available despite Whitmore's order. The message was 4 sentences. You have until the night of the gala to withdraw from this. You have no standing in this family. Whatever he's promised you, he cannot protect you from what happens when the organization decides you're a problem. Think carefully. She read it twice. Then she forwarded it to Helen and Whitmore and put her phone face down on the archive table and kept working. She told Dante about it that evening. His face did the thing it did, went very still, very controlled, the professional stillness. But his hands, she noticed, were not still. They were resting on his knees and they tightened briefly and then relaxed deliberately, a thing he had to consciously do. I need you to understand something, he said. I'm listening. What I can protect you from and what I can't protect you from right now are not the same categories they were 3 months ago. He held her gaze. He's not making an empty threat. He has people who... I know, Imani said. I don't think you... Dante. She said his name the way he sometimes said hers. Not sharp, just placing herself in the conversation. I found evidence that a man who has been stealing from your family for decades may have arranged for your mother to die before she could expose him. I've spent 11 days finishing the work she couldn't finish. The threat he sent me is the least complicated thing in this situation. He looked at her for a long moment. I'm not minimizing it, she said. I'm telling you I've already calculated it. I calculated it on day 6 when I put that ledger page in the supply case instead of the catalog. I'm still here. Something moved across his face that was not the unguarded quality she had come to recognize. This was something older and quieter. She looked at it and understood that whatever it was taking him some effort to sit in front of her while feeling it. All right, he said. She nodded. Is the decoding finished? He said. Tomorrow, she said. I need one more day. He stood to leave. At the door he stopped, the way he sometimes stopped, without quite turning back. Imani. Yes. After this is over. He stopped again. There are things I want to say that I think should wait until this is over. She understood what he was not saying. She also understood, with the clear-eyed honesty that had been the central organizing principle of her life since childhood, that this was not the moment for it. Then they'll wait, she said. He left. She worked until 2 in the morning and finished the decoding. The night of the gala arrived cold and clear, the sky above Chicago flat black and glittering, the kind of November night that felt like the city had been scraped clean of everything unnecessary. Imani arrived at the Vercelli Grand at 7 o'clock. She wore a dark blue gown she had bought with the first check from Dante's commission. Not the most expensive thing she had ever seen, but it fit correctly and moved the way she needed it to move. And when she stood straight in it, she looked like what she was, a person who had decided, definitively and without apology, to take up the space that belonged to her. Carlo met her at the service entrance, which made her smile briefly. Not because it was the service entrance, because he had come himself, which was his way of saying something he would never say directly. He's inside already, Carlo said. The guests have been arriving for an hour. Miss Marsh is at the back of the ballroom with Mr. Whitmore and 2 of his colleagues. And Lucian? Carlo's face did a careful thing. He arrived at 6. He has 4 people with him, not hotel staff. Which exits are they covering? East corridor, main entrance, the kitchen service route. Carlo paused. Not the stage access. That was always going to be the way in, Imani said. Carlo nodded once. There are 2 of Dante's security team at the stage access. They know you're coming. Good. She followed Carlo through the service corridors she had learned in her first week here, the routes she had mapped, not because she was told to stay invisible, but because she had learned over years that knowing the back routes of a place meant knowing the place itself, its bones, the way it actually worked beneath the surfaces it showed to guests. She knew this building. The stage access door was exactly where she remembered it. She went through. The ballroom was fuller than it had been a year ago. The charity gala had gained a particular notoriety after last year's event. She knew this because 3 separate press contacts had called Helen's office asking about the guest list. And the room held the specific energy of people who were present because they understood that something had happened here 12 months ago and were not entirely certain what to expect tonight. Dante was near the main entrance, speaking with 2 men she recognized as city officials. He saw her cross the back of the room from the stage access door. He did not change his expression or interrupt his conversation. He simply looked at her for exactly 2 seconds in a way that communicated everything it needed to communicate. She found Helen and Whitmore at the back table. Helen was in black, as composed as always, but with something tighter around her eyes that was the specific tension of a person waiting for a planned event that cannot be rehearsed. Whitmore was in a suit that was slightly less plain than his usual and was speaking quietly into his phone. "It's ready?" Helen said. "It's ready," Imani said. Helen looked at her for a moment. Then she reached out and briefly pressed her hand. Not a handshake, not a formal gesture. Just a moment of contact that said something Helen did not say with words. Then she released it and straightened and became the composed attorney again. "Lucian is at the east table," Helen said. "Third from the stage. He has eyes on every entrance." "Not the piano," Imani said. "Not the piano," Helen confirmed. Whitmore ended his call. "The asset documentation is filed. The moment this goes public, we initiate. My people are ready." "Understood," Imani said. She moved toward the piano. She had played on the Steinway twice since the night of her first performance, practice sessions that Dante had arranged quietly. Early mornings before the hotel opened, the ballroom lit only by work lights and the city outside the windows. She had used those sessions not to rehearse the performance, but to relearn the relationship between her hands and this specific instrument, its particular resistance and resonance, the way it responded to the weight of a touch rather than its speed. She knew this piano now. She stood beside it for a moment, looking at the room, at the assembled crowd in their formal clothing, the soft percussion of conversation and glassware, the warm light that made everything look intentional. She looked for Lucian and found him at the third table from the stage, as Helen had said, seated, watching her with an expression that contained no performance and no smoothness, just the flat attention of a man watching a situation he intends to interrupt. He had 4 people placed at the exits. She had mapped them as she crossed the room. She had one thing he didn't. She had the music. Dante appeared at the edge of the stage. He had excused himself from the city officials and crossed the room and was standing 3 feet from her. And when she looked at him, his expression was, for once, not controlled at all. "The screens are connected," he said. "Carlo has the projection equipment ready. The moment you begin the final movement, the documentation will display." "He'll try to stop it," she said. "My security team is at the projection booth," Dante said. "He's not getting near it." She nodded. He looked at her. The unguarded thing was fully present now, all of it, and the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw and the stillness that was not professional anymore, but was instead the stillness of a person who has run out of armor and is standing in front of something without it. "You don't have to do this," he said. "Whitmore has enough. The legal case, she asked for it to be played," Imani said. "For you, in the music. That's what she asked for." He was quiet. "She spent the last years of her life building something she didn't get to finish," Imani said. "I'm going to finish it." He took one breath. "All right. Go to your seat," she said. He went. The room took several minutes to settle. The gala's program had listed a midnight performance by Dante. The same tradition, the same expectation. And so the gradual movement of guests toward their tables and the dimming of the room's overhead lights was not unusual. What was unusual was the woman seated at the piano. Imani heard the shift in the room's ambient sound when people registered it, a subtle reorganization of attention, the particular frequency of 200 people noticing something they had not anticipated. She did not look up from the keys. She placed her hands in position and felt the room settle into the specific silence that precedes music. She began. She played this composition from the beginning, not Dante's version, not the version from the published score, Maria's version. The full uncut architecture of what the piece had been in its final form, the way it had sounded on that stretched cassette tape, the way it sounded in the recordings she had spent 3 weeks living inside. The room was very still. She played through the first movement and the second, and she felt the composition do what it did when it was played correctly. It opened, it settled, it moved through its sections with the specific weight of something that had been built by a person who understood that music was not decoration. It was language. It was the most precise language because it did not permit the shortcuts that words permitted. You could not gesture at a feeling in music the way you could in speech. You had to find it and play it exactly. Mafia Vercelli had found it. Imani played it. She reached the third movement, the encoded section, the 18 months of hidden documentation built into the notations and the margins. And here she felt the piece change register, become something denser, carrying more weight than the sections before it. She did not change her approach. She played it the way you played grief and knowledge simultaneously, the way you played something that had cost its maker more than anyone in the room would ever know. On the screens above the ballroom, the first document appeared. She heard the shift in the room, a collective intake, a new quality of attention, the sound of 200 people suddenly understanding that what was happening was not a performance in the way they had expected a performance. She did not look at the screens. She kept playing. The documents moved in sequence. The first ledger page, Maria's handwriting in the margin, the corresponding household account withdrawals, the shell company structures, the account codes and their trails, the second ledger page with the 12 words on its back. Each document appeared at the precise moment in the music where it was encoded. Imani's timing was exact because she had spent 11 days making it exact, because Maria had encoded each document into a specific musical moment, and Imani had learned to play each of those moments as the keys they were. She heard someone stand up, somewhere to her left. The movement had a specific quality, abrupt, purposeful. Lucian. She kept playing. She heard Dante's voice from somewhere near the center of the room, not raised, just present, carrying the authority of someone who did not need to raise his voice. She could not make out the words. She heard Lucian's voice respond, sharp and bitten off. She kept playing. The fourth movement began. This was the section Maria had never completed. The section that existed in the recordings as unfinished, trailing off mid-phrase, the evidence of a woman who had run out of time. Imani had studied that unfinished section for 3 weeks. She had understood what it was reaching for. She had understood the direction it was moving, the emotional and structural logic of where it needed to go. This was the section she had written herself. She played into the unfinished measure where Maria's recording ended, and instead of stopping, she continued. Her own composition, built from everything she had heard and learned and understood in 3 weeks of living inside this woman's music, extending the phrase in the direction it had been pointing, giving it the resolution it had not been allowed. The room was absolutely silent. She heard, somewhere behind her, a sound that might have been a struggle, something physical, brief, immediately controlled. Lucian's people at the exits, Whitmore's colleagues. She did not turn around. She played the final passage. The chord resolution, Maria's variation, the one Dante had been playing wrong for 20 years, the warmth and the settling and the thing that felt like a door opening. She played it with everything she had, the full weight of 11 days and 6 weeks and 17 years, and a cardboard box in a corridor in Indiana, and the middle note held exactly as long as it needed to hold. And the resolution bloomed open in the acoustic space of the room, and the last note faded, and she lifted her hands. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then the ballroom erupted. Not the polite applause of a wealthy charity event, the response of people who had just witnessed something that had reorganized them in some way they were still working out. Imani sat at the piano and breathed. Then she stood. She turned around and looked at the room. The screens above the ballroom still showed the final document, Maria's 12 words, written on the back of a torn ledger page. If something happens to me, the music tells the story. Play it for Dante. Whitmore was moving through the room with purpose, his 2 colleagues flanking him. Helen was on her phone at the back table, already, the yellow legal pad in her other hand. Lucian was standing at his table. He had not made it to the exit. Dante's security team had positioned themselves during the performance in a way that had closed every route without making a scene. He was standing with the particular stillness of a man who has played every card he holds, and turned them all over and found the hand insufficient. He was looking at Imani. She looked back. She thought about the message he had sent her. You have no standing in this family. She thought about every room she had cleaned, every corridor she had pushed a cart through, every wealthy guest who had looked through her like she was furniture. She thought about Marcus and his weight jokes and the 37 other temp workers at 6 agencies in 10 years who had been as invisible as she had been and had not, through no fault of their own, happened to find a cardboard box in a corridor in Indiana. She didn't say anything to Lucian. There was nothing to say that the screens above them had not already said. Whitmore reached Lucian's table and spoke quietly. Lucien's lawyer, the corporate attorney from the Loop, who had apparently been a guest this evening, appeared at his elbow and said something rapid and low. Whitmore's colleague produced paperwork. Lucian sat back down. His face had gone to a place she had not seen on it before. Not smooth, not constructed, not the careful smile that didn't reach his eyes. Just a face. Just a man who had run a long game and lost it in a room full of people who could not be selectively told otherwise. Dante appeared beside her. He stood close enough that she could hear him breathe. He looked at the room, at Whitmore and Helen, and the documentation still on the screens, and the captains who had been present tonight, who were currently standing in a cluster near the east exit, looking at each other with the specific expressions of men reassessing a great deal very quickly. He looked at Lucian. He was quiet for a long time. "It's done?" he said finally. "The criminal referral is filed," Imani said. "Whitmore initiated the moment I began the final movement. Helen has the cooperation agreement structured. The captains who are here tonight saw the evidence at the same time as everyone else. He can't privately revise what they saw. And the organization, the legal businesses can be stabilized," she said. "The 2 that suspended operations, they suspended on Lucian's instruction. With him removed, that instruction goes away. Helen has counsel ready for the operational restructuring." He looked at her. "You've been planning the aftermath." "Someone had to," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, something rougher and more genuine than a laugh. She looked at him. The unguarded quality was completely present now. All of it, with nothing professional over the top of it. He looked, she thought, like a man who had carried something very heavy for a very long time and had put it down and was still working out what his body felt like without it. "You said there were things you wanted to say," she said, "when this was over." "Yes. It's over." He looked at her, then at the piano, then back at her. "My mother chose that piece," he said, "because she said it was the only composition she'd ever written that told the truth about how she felt about this family. What she loved and what frightened her and what she hoped it could become." He paused. "I didn't understand what she meant when she told me that. I was 9 years old. And now?" "I think she meant that love and fear are not opposites," he said. "She was afraid of what this family was. She loved what it could be. She built the evidence and hid it and hoped someone would finish it for the same reason." He looked at Imani directly. "Because some things need finishing." Imani said nothing for a moment. "She was right about the final section," Imani said. "What it needed to be. It needed to resolve. It couldn't end where she left it." "You heard what it was trying to be," Dante said. "Yes. You always hear that." She looked at him. The way he said it landed differently than the way someone said, "You're talented" or "You're gifted." Those words which people used to describe a thing they admired from a distance. This was something else. This was the specific recognition of a person who had spent 30 years around music and understood the difference between technical skill and the capacity to hear what a thing was trying to become. She was not going to cry in this ballroom in front of 200 people. She had cried once in the last decade when her mother died, and it had been in private. "Thank you," she said. Just that. He nodded. Around them, the room was beginning to reorganize itself. The sound of a large gathering that has witnessed something significant and is now processing it through conversation, movement, the ordinary mechanics of human beings dealing with the extraordinary by returning to the familiar. Helen was moving through the room. Whitmore's people were still at Lucian's table. The loyal captains had made their way toward Dante and were waiting with the deferential patience of men who understood that this was a moment requiring him and were willing to wait their turn. "You should go to them," Imani said. Dante looked at the captains. "Yes." He looked back at her. "Will you stay?" "A little longer," she said. "I want to speak with Helen." He moved toward the captains. She watched him go. The straight back, the measured pace, the professional stillness that was back in place now, because it was needed again. She thought about what he'd said. Some things need finishing. She thought about the conversation he had indicated he wanted to have. The things he'd said would wait until after. She thought about the $43 that had been in her bank account a year ago and the rent that had been due in 9 days. She thought about what she wanted. It surprised her, actually. The clarity of it. She had spent so long not being in a position to think about what she wanted that she had developed a habit of not thinking about it, of redirecting that particular mental energy toward what was necessary, what was practical, what was survivable. She was not sure exactly when the habit had formed. Probably somewhere around 15, probably around the time she learned that wanting things that were not immediately achievable was a form of weight you couldn't afford. She crossed the ballroom to where Helen was concluding a call. Helen lowered the phone. She looked at Imani with the expression she saved for moments when something had gone not just correctly but significantly. The specific satisfaction of someone who had structured an outcome carefully and watched it land exactly. "The referral is formally filed," Helen said. "The cooperation framework is in place. Whitmore's colleagues are processing Lucian's documentation now." She paused. "It's going to be a long legal process." "I know." "Months, possibly longer." "I know." "You may be called to testify about the documentary chain," Helen said, "and the musical encoding, which means you'll need to be accessible, present." "I intend to be present," Imani said. Helen looked at her steadily. "Dante asked me to convey something, separately from the legal matters. He's established a fund. He discussed it with me last week, for a music education initiative." She paused carefully. "He said the specifics should be worked out with you, what it looks like, what it does, who runs it." Imani was quiet. "He said it was your idea to make," Helen said, "not his. He was clear about that." Imani looked at the piano. At the Steinway that had been Maria Vercelli's, that sat in this room and had waited, in the way that objects waited, for the thing that would finally be asked of it. I want to talk to the conservatories, Imani said. There are programs for adult learners that are underfunded, and children's programs in neighborhoods where the equipment is 20 years old and there's one music teacher for 500 students. All right, Helen said. I want it named for both of them, Imani said. Maria Vercelli and Dante. Not a charity gala name, something that means something to the work. I'll tell him. And I want to be the one who runs it, Imani said. Not as a figurehead, actually runs it. Helen's expression shifted into something warmer than her professional composure usually allowed. I'll tell him that too. Imani nodded. She looked at the room one last time. The ballroom of the Vercelli Grand Hotel, with its warm light and its marble and its assembled gathering of people who had come tonight expecting the tradition of a wealthy family's charity event and had instead witnessed a dead woman's voice arrive through 30 years of silence and say what it had been trying to say all along. She picked up her bag. She walked toward the stage access door. The route Carlo had shown her, the bones of the building, the way the place actually worked. She passed the piano on her way and put one hand on it briefly, just the weight of her palm against the polished case, the way you acknowledge something that had mattered. Then she let it go and walked through the door. 6 months later, on a Tuesday morning in May, the Vercelli Brooks Music Initiative held its first information session in a rented space on the north side of the city. The room held 43 people, not wealthy donors in formal wear, parents in work clothes who had come on their lunch breaks and after-school hours, a 16-year-old who had taken 2 buses to be there, a retired postal worker who had always wanted to learn and had always been told it was too late. Imani stood at the front of the room with a printed sheet listing what the initiative provided: instruments, instruction, scholarships for children, evening classes for adults who had never had the chance or had been told the chance had passed. She had been taking composition classes herself for 4 months. Her professor, a woman of 60 who taught at the conservatory and had agreed to take Imani on with the specific enthusiasm of someone who recognized what they were working with, had told her in their 3rd session that she had the instinct of someone who had been listening seriously her entire life. I have, Imani had said. Her professor had looked at her and said, then we just need to teach you the rest. The information session ran for 2 hours. At the end of it, 31 people had signed up for programs. The 16-year-old who had taken 2 buses had filled out an application for a full scholarship. He played guitar, he said, but wanted to learn piano. He had never had lessons. He had learned by listening to recordings and practicing on whatever was available. Imani looked at his application for a moment before she signed the approval. We can start next week, she said. The room cleared. Imani packed up the materials and folded the information table and stacked the chairs with the efficient, unhurried movements of someone who had been doing physical work since she was 15 and did not consider it beneath her. She was carrying the last stack of chairs to the storage closet when the door opened. Dante stood in the doorway. He was not in a suit. He was in the particular version of casual that men wore when they were trying to dress like regular people and couldn't quite get there, but it was a genuine attempt. He looked at the room, at the folded table, the stacked chairs, the printed materials she hadn't finished boxing. How did it go? He said. 31 sign-ups, she said, out of 43. He did the math. That's 72%, she said. Yes. He looked at her the way he had looked at her that first morning in his office, when she had told him what she needed access to and he had listened, the way of a man recalibrating, adjusting the picture. Except the adjustments now were smaller because the picture had been revised enough times that it was starting to be accurate. You need help with the chairs? He said. I have the chairs, she said. She put them in the storage closet. He held the closet door because the hinge was uneven and it swung back without being held. She came out and he let it close and they stood in the empty room together. The legal process, she said. Whitmore called me last week. I know. He called me too. It's going to trial, she said. Lucian isn't cooperating. No, Dante said. He won't. They'll call me as a witness on the musical encoding. A musicologist from Northwestern verified the system last month. They want me to explain the documentary chain in court. Will you? Yes, she said. Of course. He nodded. He looked at the room again. At the folded table, the sign on the wall she hadn't taken down yet, the initiative's name in plain black type on a white background. Simple. Meant to be readable from across a room. She would have liked this, he said. Your mother? Yes. I think so too, Imani said. The instrument access part especially. She didn't come from money. Did you know that? I found it in the letters. She didn't study in Milan because her family had connections. She studied in Milan because a woman in her town recognized what she was and found her a scholarship. Dante looked at her. I didn't know that. Someone saw her, Imani said. That's all. Someone saw her and made it possible. She looked at the sign on the wall. That's what this is. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the May morning was doing what May did after a long Chicago winter, asserting itself warm and specific, the kind of light that convinced you it had always been like this. I said there were things I wanted to say, Dante said. You did, Imani said. I've been trying to find the right way to say them for 6 months. How's that going? She said. The corner of his mouth moved. Poorly. Then say them wrong, she said. He looked at her. The unguarded quality, fully present, nothing professional over the top of it, nothing between what he felt and what was visible on his face. She had come to understand over 6 months that this was not a quality he showed many people. She had come to understand over 6 months that she was one of a very small number of people who made him feel that the armor was unnecessary. You walked into a room full of people who had decided what you were, he said, and you didn't ask them to revise their decision. You just behaved according to what you actually were and let the room catch up. I didn't have a choice, she said. I said it before I thought about it. That's what I mean, he said. You didn't have a plan. You had a standard, something that you held yourself to even when it cost you. He paused. I had plans. I had architecture. I had 20 years of building systems to keep the wrong things from being visible. And none of it was... He stopped. It wasn't a standard. It was a structure. Those are different things. She looked at him. You chose the truth over your cousin. That night in the ballroom, when Lucian accused me, you put the ledger on the table. Yes. That was a standard, she said. He was quiet. You've been paying attention longer than you think, she said. Outside, a car passed, the sound of the city going about its morning. She had a class with her composition professor in 2 hours. She had a call with Helen after that and a site visit for a potential partner school in the afternoon. I want to say something practical, Dante said. All right. The initiative needs a permanent space. I have a property on the north side. It used to be a recording studio, actually. It's been sitting vacant for 3 years. I want you to look at it. I can do that, she said. And I want to ask whether you'd have dinner with me, he said. Not about the initiative, not about the legal process. Just dinner. She looked at him for a moment. 6 months ago, in his office, he had gestured toward the chair across from his desk and not offered her coffee and told her what he needed with no preamble. He had been the man in the room who set the terms. He was not setting terms now. He was asking. She thought about that. About what it had cost him, probably, to get from there to here. About what it cost anyone to take down the architecture they had built over 20 years and look at what was actually underneath. Thursday, she said. Thursday, he confirmed. She picked up the last box of materials. He held the door. She walked out into the May morning and the city opened around her. The sound of it, the size of it, all the parallel stories moving in their parallel directions. And she walked toward the bus stop with the particular steadiness of someone who had never needed anyone to tell her she belonged somewhere, who had simply gone to the places she needed to go and done what she needed to do and let the rooms, one by one, catch up. Behind her, the sign on the wall of the rented room read its plain black name into the empty space. And inside a storage room in the Vercelli Grand Hotel, in a cardboard box in a temperature-controlled archive, a woman's handwriting waited in the margins of sheet music that had already done what it was built to do, had already carried what it was asked to carry across 30 years of silence, and delivered it with complete fidelity to the one person in all the world who had been listening closely enough to hear.